Hello and welcome to your Wednesday evening weirding session. I'm your host, C. Savory, creator of Fractal Praxis. Just a quick reminder, why do I call these weirding sessions? Because I'm divulging my worldview, which I have reason to believe is somewhat, if not drastically different than yours. So, the more you expose yourself to my worldview, which is fully opt-in, the more potentially weird your own will get. So welcome in. I am very tired from a lifestyle that I make a lot of meaning from and that I choose, but that has me engaging as a land steward and an organizational steward and a relational steward. This talk, though, I wanted to put such attention into that I ended up making a talk that is twice as long as it needs to be. So I am going to be breaking this up into two talks because I think the content is important. Last week I was kind of riffing and improvising on the theme of meaning, which kind of worked. There's obviously so much to say about meaning making in the context of living systems. But for this week, I'm going to talk about agency, and I put more effort into saying clear things about it. So I hope you enjoy. So yes, of course, last week what I spoke about was the discipline of developing meaning in your life. As a practitioner of fractal praxis, meaning making is your first discipline. The more powerful the meanings you make, the more effective they are, which is a whole other talk unto itself. The more sovereign you can become. So in this talk, we'll be diving into developing sovereignty or agency, which I consider the second discipline of fractal praxis. Freedom from habitual existence. In my experience, it's not possible to overcome an unwanted pattern in my life, whether that pattern is external or internal to me, until I first understand it as a pattern. To overcome some unwanted experience, some unwanted friction or cognitive dissonance, it's skillful to identify it clearly, and that is the payoff of meaning making. With the knowing gained from meaning, we have a name for this phenomenon, or a internal shape, an understanding for it. And therefore we're able to discern the pattern from the noise of the landscape in general, so that you can begin consciously interacting with this shape, having picked it out from the background. And when you act differently, when you act in a different pattern than your habitual way, you will quickly find that the world responds to you also in a different pattern. And when we think about freedom, I think what we're really after is the freedom to be who and what we are in this somewhat more of a frictionless way. And that looks like developing sovereignty, and it also looks like wild living beings that we see in the wilderness. More on that later. But we want freedom from undue or unjust or unwanted external forces. So let's get into how and why we develop freedom, the freedom we so desire naturally, internally, and where we got divorced from a kind of freedom that used to empower us when we were free to live as wild beings. Ultimately, we seek a freedom to enact ourselves fully. But this requires meaning, making meaning about oneself and what one's gifts are to offer. So agency first requires meaning. Agency and meaning are braided together. The more you enact oneself, the more meaning you make, the more meaning you have, the more reason you have to try to enact oneself. Agency means not just acting automatically, habitually from conditioning, but acting purposely on the basis of the meaning that you're making from things. It means making choices and moving towards what feels more right in your system. And in the process, doing lots of discernment and differentiation from the patterns or noise in your environment. Maslow characterized self-actualization as the peak of human attainment. That is the peak of how humans can apply their energy to their own lives. Survival conditions like food, shelter, community for humans is at the base of the pyramid, with self-actualization at the top. This has been disputed, and it's even been proposed that it needs to be flipped upside down, but I think there's some truth to Maslow's framework. But consider that the more awareness one develops, the more one's definition of self, that is the self we are enacting, also is subject to shift and evolve into perhaps a more holistic story. So every time we actualize a self moment to moment, we are putting certain energies into the world and we are taking others out of the world. This is directly linked to evolutionary process that we are all immersed in. Indeed, our agency is our vector of change and change making in the world. With the meaning we give ourselves and our lives, we make commitments of energy and enactment that shape the world. And by the world, I also mean the conditions for all other beings to enact themselves in. Agency involves cultivating this selective force in our lives. By directing my attention here, I grow this. By depriving it to something else dies back from not receiving my attention. Permaculture and indigenous lifeways tend to teach these very foundational concepts. It's a lot like existential gardening. The more awareness we develop, the more of a handle we have on the patterns in our lives, and we can choose consciously, which we're about to get into, how to choose consciously, what to propagate and what to prune back. So in general, we want to increase the total amount of our lives that we can possibly be aware of. Furthermore, we want to increase the amount we can have understanding of. And this is where meaning making comes in, of course. And then we also want to cultivate the decision-making power, the ability to have skillful interactions. And that's what agency is all about. Discernment is so important and is a part of the function of meaning making. It involves discerning in this place of agency, this arena of agency. We need to be able to discern different parts of ourselves and our conditional story of self versus our true self. We also need to have the ability to differentiate from the forces in our environment, the inherited culture and environment that we inhabit, and to separate ourselves enough to get our own ideas and to create our own path. Living out one's truest self requires these strong powers of discerning what is really right for who is really me, right? This leads to the capacity to defy one's conditioning and even defy powerful extrinsic orders, social or political or otherwise, in favor of attaining an internal reduction of cognitive dissonance by living out a life closer to the self or closer to the truth. With this desire and conviction within us to be true to ourselves, we are capable of this, creating of space between our ordinary habitual operations and our choices, so that we can begin defying our conditioning, not by denying or opposing our conditioning, but by redirecting the energy contained in the very patterns of our conditioning, redirecting it into more holistic, aligned purposes. This is power. This is a human being's power in the world, is what we discern and what we select for. So a big question here regarding selection is which version of yourself are you predominantly acting or operating from? Which one are you selecting for? Which beliefs are you enacting and therefore propagating into the world? Which patterns or parts of yourself get emphasized and what gets de-emphasized? To enact oneself means taking action somehow beyond the reactive or automatic. That is, we're doing something intelligent, informed by our being and our consciousness. And this requires utilizing something that is called the central channel of decision making and processing. This is critical for devising responses that are currently outside the scope of our habits of self. So I'm going to take some time now to go into the central channel processing. I'm weaving together a few different frameworks for understanding the human body mind and the states that it is in when it is sense making and when it is navigating decisions. So let's look at the body mind states. I will call them body mind states. To me, the body and the mind are actually a unified system, and there's certain phenomenal states that they can be in that profoundly affect the sense making and decision making. So the first one we'll look at is survival mode. That is the sympathetic nervous system response. This sympathetic nervous system response is characterized by a reactivity and a intense attunement to external stimuli. So surviving, seeking food or water or reproduction or shelter. And I think in the modern world, many of us are operating from survival mode chronically because on some level there's not enough we can do, there's not enough that we can achieve or whatever it might be. I mean, when I was growing up as a child and adolescent, what I recall is a chronic state of stress and of survival. Like I was in survival mode all the time. So this might be familiar to you. Oftentimes certain hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are activated. Which makes us highly reactive and in a way judgmental of what is happening in our environments. We make quick automatic decisions, which has a real application in survival scenarios, like dodging out of the way of a car that's driving at you. But it also limits, this state of mind and this state of decision making literally limits the amount of information we can process in our decisions. It limits our minds and perceptions. So when we're frozen in survival mode all the time, we're stuck with automatic processing, which tends to give pretty poor quality results in our lives. It might solve certain short-term, fast problems, but it overall tends to degrade the quality of our lives. The parasympathetic nervous system state exists within us as a counterbalance to the sympathetic nervous system. With the parasympathetic nervous system online, the body and mind can relax. They begin restoring themselves. They become looser, more lateral and associative in organization, the body-mind, that is. We are in this state capable of practicing a different kind of processing called central processing or controlled processing. This is the kind of mindset that we employ when we are solving complex problems, holding lots of information in mind at once and kind of having it work itself out. It's important to note that this state of rest is not a dissociative state. In fact, it can be a state of a deep sense of integration and kind of connection with one's environment, but it's just not being so activated or stimulated by one's environment. This is an integrative state. It's like what happens when we're sleeping, resting and restoring. So we are present in these states. This state presents ways of seeing and understanding things entirely distinct from what can be seen or known while in survival mode. The central processing style of cognition is somewhat slower and consumes more actual energy, like more measurable brain energy, than automatic decisions. But it makes possible deliberative, deep thinking that, again, helps us differentiate from all the different patterns involved in a certain situation and can guide us to making purposeful, considered actions. So, to increase agency, one must go beyond survival and enter into these initiations of mastery, of being so good at living that you have achieved sovereignty and are capable of inhabiting ease more often. Those relaxed states unlock even more insights and powerful thinking, which is a virtuous cycle. As you can see, the more insight you have, the more meaning things have that's accurate, just the more effective your life can be, and therefore the more at rest you can be. So it's a virtuous cycle. Furthermore, in these relaxed states, you might even find yourself having access to intelligence beyond yourself, something I'll be going much more into in the third discipline of Fractal Praxis talk, which is coming up later, which is the talk on sync, S-Y-N-C-H, or intuition, sync meaning synchronization. To move out of automatic reaction and reiteration of patterns, where we're just cycling the karma that we encounter, and into selective reaction and reiteration of patterns, selective reaction and reiteration of patterns, requires us to tone our nervous systems by developing the parasympathetic response and cultivating that in our lives, actually. Many of us live in survival mode more hours of more days than we might be wanting to admit, but it's more than just for our health that we need to break out of that cycle and find ways to make space for reflection, for feeling, for contemplating, because this will reshape our definition of self and the lives that we are enacting. I think sometimes thinking and developing and honing our thinking minds gets kind of a bad rap in today's culture, because people are rightfully traumatized and resistant toward this dominance of the mind in the Western imperialist colonial culture and project, this mind heavy culture is a way of justifying oppression, actually, and how it can reject any truths that it cannot perceive except through so-called rationality, right? So there are real problems with that, culturally, but I think that to use our intelligence to actually think effectively, to use our central channel processing, which means slowing down enough to really contemplate information, assess the patterns in play, and formulate a strategic decision. To do this is to uplift the brilliant design at the heart of ourselves as living beings. Which is that through our ability to intelligently parse patterns and interact so as to modify reality, we participate in the making of reality and therefore can contribute to what life needs and what life wants, which is greater complexity in the universe. We need to be self-organized and fully responsible for the results we obtain in order to be sovereign. This next talk, following this one, will be a continuation of this teaching, going into additional concepts about sovereignty, living as a wild being, wild and wilderness as order and self-organizing, and how that really is the freedom we are all after, and what it could look like to cultivate this living, dynamic culture through loving life as practitioners of fractal praxis, and how we can devote our agency and our power, our will, actually, to the purposes of life. That's coming up in the next talk. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Now is the time where we pass the proverbial basket. Please make a donation to Fractal Praxis if you enjoy this content at fractalpraxis.com/donate, or consider becoming a member. We have an Engager membership that's just $8 a month, and that allows you to get kind of previews of some of the lecture and book writing content that I'm generating. So I encourage you to do that if you want to have some deeper discussions and deeper dives with me about Fractal Praxis. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Merry meet and merry part, and merry meet again.